First of all, just very briefly, the Swedish Energy Agency is an agency that works very close to the government, but we are what's called semi-autonomous, which is very unique in Sweden. It basically means that you have your government, you have a very small department of people working on energy issues, about 25 people, and then you have 3 key agencies that work on energy issues. One is the government TSO, the grid. One is the inspectorate that makes sure that the markets work as they should work. And then everything else is managed by the Swedish Energy Agency. So we work on energy efficiency. We do all the policy implementations. We do the analysis, the data collection. We have a very significant research and development budget. We do all the climate issues. We work on renewable energy development throughout the country. So a broad spectrum of issues that are on our table. Currently, I work on a number of issues, all from sort of offshore wind conditions to stimulate that for the next steps in the development of the electricity certificate scheme, to developing a national transport strategy for Sweden, to expert-based clean tech development and funds allocated, I mean, you name it, energy efficiency issues, new sector strategies. It's very broad. So I've got a great team of about sort of 400 people that work on these types of issues. Well, I'd like to sort of, I made some changes after the wonderful presentation from my friend and colleague, the professor, this morning on the statistics. I have a bit different pictures, but I'd like to comment on that, what you presented earlier. And for that, let's go back. Somebody recognize these 2 gentlemen? Edison, Bell, Graham Bell, Alexander Graham Bell. And just to put things in perspective, because I very much like the theme of your meeting here, energy transition. If Alexander Graham Bell would come back today and assess what's happened in society, he would not have a clue what goes on. This iPhone, what is that? If people communicating with each other the way we do now, it's a huge transition that has taken place there over the years. But if Edison would come back and took a look around, yeah, that's about what I expected it to look like. Not much has changed in the basic thinking of what Edison put in place over 100 years ago. That's quite an interesting aspect. And now things are speeding up. I think that in the next 5 years in our sector, things will go faster and happen more than has happened over the past 50 years. And what does that to a mind and to the sort of the concerns and the analysis and the thinking that we need to make sure that this transition that we're all talking about actually ends up where we would like it to go. And we have all these elements that are sort of impacting on how we think in society. Everything from that we finally have a climate agreement. We have sustainable development goals. But we also have sort of major pollution in cities around the world where people suffering health problems, where this is clearly unsustainable and actually driving faster and harder in certain transitions than what the climate agreement from Paris does. But of course, then talk about digitalization, new businesses, and in the center, our mind that tries to deal with all these issues. There was a clever man, I can't remember who it said, but it may have been one of the CEOs, that if the rate of change goes faster on the outside than on the inside, you're in trouble. I've worked in the power sector and for a number of years, and I think this is the case. And it's not only in business, it is also in government. Good. A great example. So when Edison, coming back to him, did his light bulb. He replaced actually sort of the rock oil kerosene from the Rockefellers. And before that, we had oil and town gas. And before that, we had whale oil. And we always thought that we would run out of whales, which would cause that we would then shift to something else. But it wasn't like that. And the whole whale industry, which was basically a fifth of the US BNP at that point in time, went to the grave. We invented the light bulb. Edison did that. 20 times more efficient. And that continued developing. And the big breakthrough, lead, came in place. Huh? Much more efficient. In a decade, the lead lamps made sort of 30 times more efficient, 20 times more bright, and 10 times cheaper. And that continued. And the interesting aspect also is that Edison actually understood how important it is to sell the function of light instead of a kilowatt hour. So he understood that if I sell sort of for 1 cent light for an hour, then if there will be more efficient light bulbs, I will reap that benefit and not the customer. But he was overruled, and we're still facing the dilemmas of that today because we're selling kilowatt hours. And that means that the revenues of energy efficiency end up somewhere else instead of that I get sort of more costs. Same with the oil and gas industry. They sell molecules, not mobility or a hot bath or a cold beer. Major breakthroughs, significant changes happened. Who thought that we could fly around the world without a drop of fossil fuel? A drop of fuel, just a few years ago. We did that. And now actually, airplane manufacturers, they have built a sort of electric airplane part of their business. What can we do? How can we develop this? Technological breakthrough is going one after the other there, and costs are going down. For the energy industry, this was something that one could call, that I've called, a perfect storm. Things started to happen there around sort of 2007, 2008, 2009, et cetera, et cetera. One after the other, things happened in our sector that created this perfect storm, that added force to this power, step by step. And we all seen sort of the values of companies being cut down and a struggle to find the new business models. And I'm sure you've also seen that around you. So, my reading of what then the reaction is of a lot of the companies is a bit of this. Sort of these good intentions. We really like to do this. It's good. But still then that action part and really understanding what does this mean for my business idea is still lacking. And there's new companies establishing all the time, taking new market shares, having different margins. It's not easy to be a CEO of an energy utility or a power and gas company maneuvering around these types of areas. So then let's focus in and look a bit at Sweden, because that's, I think, why you asked me here. 2020, we have targets that we've agreed on. 10% renewable energy for transport. We're easily going to make that because one of our gasoline selling companies and refineries decided to blend up to 17%. So we're already at 17% of renewable fuels in the energy sector, just by blending that. 40% reduction of greenhouse gases, we also managed that. We're at close to 50 in reduction from the 2005 perspective. 20% energy efficiency. It looked like as if we're not going to make that exactly. It would end up somewhere around 19% until one of our companies decided to close down 2 of our nuclear plants. And now we're up above 20% because that's how we calculate. It's energy into the country, energy out of the country. And that's 20%. Succeeded. I'll get back to the nuclear issue. And then 50% renewable energy, and we're easily over that also. Good. The nuclear issue. One of the triggering events in Sweden over a number of years ago, about 3 years ago, was that we suddenly started talking about the economic lifespan of our reactors instead of our technical lifespan of our reactors. This was very significant because until that point in time, the companies and the scientists all quibbled about we can extend the lifetime. We are world champions on extending lifetimes of nuclear reactors. And we were up at sort of some of them 60 years, 65, 70 discussions. Here suddenly we saw a shift in the costs compared to other alternatives. And we saw the profitability of the oldest reactors being so bad that the company said, we're going to close them down. And with the first one, we have 10 reactors in Sweden. The first one, everybody said, yeah, fine, do that. It's small, it's big, we don't care. The second one, yes. But then it started to become a political issue. And everybody started to wonder, what is this? What is happening at the moment? Shall we just close them down? We can't close them down. They're providing for up to 40% of our electricity production. So with that, we started to understand that because the policy that was in place by then was that if you want to invest in new nuclear, you have to replace old nuclear. So if we close down a plant, then investors can put in a new nuclear facility. But no one wanted to invest. Nobody was there to invest. Yeah, there was an obscure Russian and Chinese company that wanted to come in and say, yes, we could help you here. And that created a whole other discussion. But it became clear that, wait a minute, something's going on in the mix of our in our energy security discussion, but also in our energy mix discussion about where we're heading. And that discussion became actually the reason why we established a commission of all the parties that we have in Sweden with the particular mission to say, okay, how is the future mix going to look like? What are we going to do? Focusing on electricity. So this group of people worked 2 years, basically. This is including the secretariat. We have our minister in the middle. You should recognize at least one person in this picture. And we reached an agreement with the 5 main political parties, which is about 80% of our parliamentary constituency. We were going to do 100% renewable electricity in 2040 and no stop date for nuclear. So a similar situation that, okay, how is this going to work? This is a typical compromise situation where, okay, we're going to produce 100% renewable electricity, but there's no stop date for nuclear. That means that we can, whatever we produce in terms of nuclear could be the same amount that we export. And that was a way to get around a discussion that we've had for a long, long time. We also set 50% energy efficiency in 2030 through other different but connected policy discussions. We agreed on zero emissions, net zero emissions for greenhouse gas in 2045. And we established a climate law and what I call the Climate Oversight Commission, basically a commission that assesses the policies of the government and gives their recommendation on what will work and what is in conflict with the overall climate targets. Now, and there was a whole lot of other more detailed issues that I can add here, but a tax was removed, the hydro tax was deleted. We had an extra extension of what we call our green certificate scheme to establish more wind, bio. Our green certificate scheme, for those that don't know, is we set a target plus 18 terawatt hours in 2030, and it's technology neutral, it is market based. So basically that technology that's cheapest will be put onto the market in order to achieve those 18 terawatt hours. but also another package of energy efficiency programs for industry, transmission investments, energy taxes, etc. Now, beyond the fact that this was a very breakthrough agreement, one of the key things this agreement did was to break through a very polarized discussion on single energy source, so single energy sources. We had a very polarized discussion about nuclear. You were basically divided into sort of the energy discussion. Are you pro-nuclear or against nuclear? Are you pro-hydropower or against hydropower? Are you for wind power or against wind power? Or for bio or against it? It was so compartmentalized. We weren't able to have a normal discussion about the whole, the holistic perspective. How does this energy system going to work? And what this agreement actually did was to lift this discussion one level up and say, we need to talk package. We need to understand that everything here fits together. If we look at the energy transition, we need to look at the industry transition and at the transport transition. Because otherwise we don't get a 1 + 1 = 3 discussion in place that makes it cost effective and worthwhile doing it. And this is often, I don't know how the discussion goes in Quebec, but I've recognized this very much in many parts of the world, where you have groups of people sitting talking about bioenergy, you have groups of people that sitting and talking about transmissions and smart homes and things like that, and you have groups of people that talk about hydro and environment and all that. But they don't get together, and we don't get to create that picture that actually makes all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. So this was one of the key issues that I think this discussion sort of put in place. We have suddenly a whole different sort of foundation to work from. That doesn't mean that there's no challenges. We have huge challenges. And I think that's one of the interesting aspects. When I listen to sort of you speak here, I've been to a sort of number of sessions, a number of discussions. We have a lot in common. You have also a great starting point in terms of your sort of opportunities. You have similar issues that you need to tackle than we have. And I think you will recognize some of them here. So we should learn from each other and think of how can we create some synergies and work. If I look purely at my agency, I need to make sure that the people who work on research and development and innovation and business development and startups and clean tech, that they actually understand what the overall target is that we're trying to achieve, that my analysis people and statistics also work on, and my energy efficiency people does. So this is the universe in one organization. But if the same goes if you work that one level up to the government that needs to make sure that all the different parts talk to each other and coordinate. And that's not easy. We all know that. So these are some of the issues. We have ambitious targets, yes. And this linking of the energy transition to the industry transition and the transport transition is absolutely key. You can't get one right and the others wrong. They need to hang together and fit together, because you can only create cost-effective synergies between these if you take a holistic perspective here. Then, of course, 100% renewable electricity. What does that mean in terms of our investments or regulation? How this is going to work? Grid investments I talked about. Bioenergy is a key question, and there actually the issue is more of how can we, together with our neighbors, develop a new way of thinking about bioenergy, because we're stuck in our way of thinking and the European Union is stuck in their way of thinking. And we need to lift both in order to meet. And in my opinion, it is, at least. So that will be an interesting discussion. And then we have the issue of security and safety, especially now in the Baltic region. I mean, we have some interesting neighbors. You have some interesting neighbors, undoubtedly. Both are unpredictable, I would say. And these put different strains on the types of discussion that we have about our own energy security and how we tackle those. So let's then, when we understand those types of challenges, look back a bit. Where did we come from? What has happened? And you can only conclude that we've been through these types of changes a number of times. And we will go through these types of changes in the future also. In the 70s, our sort of energy system was basically oil and petrol based. We moved slowly to building the nuclear sites and to putting biomass in place and giving more focus to electricity as the bearer of energy. Same you see here. You see the big input of the nuclear in the late 70s, early 80s. You see the gradual decrease of the crude oil and petroleum products. Coal and coke has basically stayed the same, and that's because of the part that was used in the industry, in our energy-intensive industry, like iron ore, steel production, cement production. That's where it is. You see the increase in biomass, and in particular after the 90s, that really took place because of the district heating and the CO2 tax that we put in place. And we see an increase in the heat, primary heat, since the late 80s. Basically, hydro has been the same, and the sort of small colors that came into place then after a number of years, wind power and also other fuels and natural gas, earlier stages. Zooming in on electricity, again, there's a number of changes that have taken place. I won't dwell on those. I'm sure you'll be able to get my slides, and if you are particularly interested in that. If you look ahead, based on what I've told you so far, you can see that the electricity production is basically nuclear and hydro for the largest part, say 80%. It's slowly decreasing, and we're adding wind in a good speed, CHP, bio, that is, and industrial back pressure has been the same basically over time, largely. Now, if we're approaching 2040, this little orange block will disappear. That means that we need to be a bit above the demand curve at the end. And we're doing that. We're exporting more and more. But at some point in time, there's going to be a switch. And that will be interesting to see. And it's also a discussion that I recognize a bit here, is how much electricity are we going to produce if you're going through a transition? Because we can let the market do this, and then it will go sort of quite stop and go, tough for the industry, or we can do it with policies to make it a gradual shift. And that's what Sweden has done. So we're adding wind and bio through the electricity certificates scheme so that we create enough capacity that will then allow for the nuclear to be phased out. And my impression is, based on sort of how the market develops, that nuclear will be phased out maybe earlier than 2040, just because of the cost issue. Another issue that's very important for Sweden is its interconnectedness, the grid. This allows us to do this transition. And it's both we're a deregulated market, being well connected to our neighbors, sort of allows for the dynamics of that when we have very cheap electricity because of from our German neighbors, when there's a lot of wind and a lot of sun there, and maybe then we can import that, use it, and at the same time, when the wind is blowing less in the south, and we can use together with Norway our lakes as our green batteries to both supply ourselves, but also our neighbors in the northern parts of Europe. And this interconnectedness, we have 20% interconnectedness related to peak capacity, allows us to do that development of the system. It's both sort of a cost-effectiveness issue. But even here, I think one of the cultural shifts in our minds that we go through when you work in the energy sector is that sort of this is not about import or export of electricity and dependence on others. It is really to create a larger system that allows you to be more competitive and more cost effective because you're connected to a larger part of the system that will allow you to be more flexible. Simply. Energy efficiency I've talked about, huge potentials. I mean, I've heard also the figures from Quebec. There's a lot of work to be done. That's the only purpose of showing you this slide. Some interesting examples I thought I'd pick up on, because we've seen a number of discussions developing in a direction that to some extent I expected, but to some extent I didn't expect. We've put together, we were made responsible as the Energy Agency to coordinate with 6 other agencies a common transport strategy for Sweden. How we're going to make the transport sector fossil-free. And the government asked us to do that. We were quite surprised. I've had some number of discussions before I actually got the assignment, but still, it was, and my colleagues were even more surprised. So my colleagues in the traffic and transport agencies and in the nature and environment agencies, the cities and buildings agencies, etc. But it worked excellent, and we put together a 6-agency agreed-on strategy that we tabled for our politicians, and now they're picking and choosing from that menu, putting things in place. It's all from sort of a reduction quota system for biofuels to a coordinated approach to parking, to logistics centers, to bonus-malus systems, etc., etc. One of our key challenges is to maintain our hydro. And I say maintain because we have, I don't know about you, but we have a huge discussion about environmental values and hydro, migrating fish and all that. So the likelihood of building more hydro is not great. But just to maintain our existing hydro and making it more efficient by investing in it with new turbines, etc., that requires a legal landscape that provides for that long-term security of making those investments. And we haven't had that for a long time. So we also put together a process of setting up a fund that makes sure that all our hydro can do environmental measures, but at the same time is guaranteed to be able to produce a long time into the future, in a nutshell. One of the most interesting developments I've seen is a discussion with industry. I don't know about you, but when I talked with industry 3, 4, 5 years ago, the common reaction is always, hey, level playing field, long-term policies to create investments. If we don't like it, we move our production abroad. Do you recognize that? And in particular also, sort of, it's always other people, other sectors, government, that should do the work. It's never me. And about 2 years ago, this changed suddenly, because in a dialogue where we worked together with the steel industry, and we said, sort of, what do you think your competitiveness comes from in 20, 30, 40 years from now? And we did the exercise. We sat down and talked. And we had an extremely constructive discussion. And we put together a research and development program that we call Hybrid. It's world leading. It's the first in its kind, where we look at the possibility to replace fossil fuels in the iron ore process, the steel making process, with hydrogen. And that's, I don't know. I'm not sort of an engineer in that field, but that is quite interesting. And that the companies, 2 major companies in Sweden, together with us, want to finance this, we're talking many millions, is a very good sign. Because they don't do that because they believe they have to save the world. They do that because they believe it depends on their survival on the global market. They create their new focus for competitiveness. They believe that their customers will buy their steel if it's produced with hydrogen instead of coal, which is quite a step, I think. Another interesting aspect is that also 2 years ago, a new entrepreneur came back to Sweden, Peter Carlson. He was previously working with Tesla, head of purchasing. And he came and said, I want to build a gigafactory for batteries. And I would like to do that in Sweden. And there's one key reason why I would like to do that. It's because of your energy system. Because I believe that the cars manufacturers, if they want to go electric, whether it's hybrid or full electric, they want to buy my batteries that are produced in Sweden with CO2-free electricity. Look at the cost and then the CO2 part. The costs in Reno for the Tesla factory, you see there. The cost for a similar gigafactory in Japan for electricity is there, and the Swedish cost. I think here, Canada is not on the map because you're too large. But Quebec could be very much compared to what the Swedish competitive advantage is of the energy system, electricity system. It's quite unique. Think about that, because I see that now happening more and more. I see certain companies from Europe starting factories in Sweden because they want to have at least a segment of their production green for those customers that require that. In the transport sector, we need to make a huge change. We have a very, very sort of big transition that needs to take place. These are some of the figures that I took from a McKinsey study in the US, but I'm sure they're quite similar in Canada, and they're certainly similar to what's happening in Sweden. But I mean, your typical car spends 96% of the time parked in front of your house or in your parking garage. You use it 0.5% sitting in congestion. You use it 0.8% for looking for parking, and 2.6% for driving. There must be a better way. I saw recent figures from Sweden there. We always have the discussion that what about the sort of the areas that are more rural? What if we do something about transport, we need to think about the rest of Sweden that doesn't have access to all sort of the buses, the trams, the other systems. But the figures show that sort of 80% of all the driven kilometers by us as people, so not for goods, is driven by 25% of the population, and they're driven by male between 35 and 55 in cities for leisure purposes. That is a bit different than the discussion that we have with my colleagues. The battery costs, of course, all that's very interesting, but I'll move on. And biofuels. We have a huge discussion about flights and shall we use airplanes in the future in Sweden. And of course, if you look at the costs of biomass and if you compare it to fossil jet fuels, which is about, in Sweden, 3.4 crowns per liter, you see that it takes, at the moment, is it at least double for HVO, oils and fats, and at least 3 times as expensive for lignin and cellulose. And again, you could make that similar picture putting solar up top, wind in the middle, and coal below. Of course, you need to stimulate and create a market and create volumes because they're not there. You need to have the technology development. That's why it's so extremely important that I work with my agency with businesses on developing these alternatives and then lowering the cost. Now we have a situation that even in Oman, we use solar energy to pump up oil. Who would have thought that for a number of years ago? That's transition in place right there. And I'll close with this. To again then think about the mind and the culture that we have in our head when we go through a transition. this is not only a matter of technology. It is also understanding the technology on our behavior, on our societies, etc. And with that, I thank you for your attention.